Stand by. We're going live. We're going live. 10, 9, going live. 7, 6, 5, going live. 4, 3, 2.
Welcome to 10 Seconds to Air. I'm Alita Guillen. Just a few reminders before I get into today's show. If you would like to subscribe to my new newsletter, Communicate Fearlessly, you can go to my website and subscribe. It's totally free, comes out monthly, and it's packed with highlights from the month. Go to alitaguillen.com. You'll find it there. I'll put a link in the show notes just to make it a little bit easier for you. Okay, on to today's podcast. Today is an argument for good argument. Debating is one of the art forms of communication. We all use debate tools every day, even when we don't know that we're using them. When we try to get our point across at work or argue with, that pesky relative, we are using certain skills to win over that argument. The rapid changes in socially accepted norms and the divisive political moment are making many of us walk on eggshells before we even express an opinion. We just simply walk away from it. We don't want to get involved. Well, today's guest says that's not good for society, and we shouldn't shy away from these arguments. We should learn the rules of debate and actually engage. My guest is Bo Seo, a two-time world debate champion. He is the former coach of the Harvard and the Australian national debate teams. He is also the author of the book Good Arguments, where he makes the case for using debate tools as a framework to lean into uncomfortable conversations. Bo says we need to restore confidence and faith in what disagreements can be. He joins me now to talk about the importance of being able to argue and explains how to have a good argument. Here now is Bo Seo. Hi, Bo. Welcome to 10 Seconds to Air.
Hi, Alita. I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, you're on the East Coast. I'm on the West Coast. If we were debating, would someone be at a disadvantage because we're talking to each other remotely here?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I just had lunch, so I'm feeling very agreeable.
Okay, well, that's good. I guess that's good for me. I'm not going to try to argue with you. This is going to be a good conversation. I just finished your book, Good Arguments. It was fascinating on so many levels. I just can't wait to dive into all of it. But I want to begin with mindset. You have participated in how many debates? Hundreds.
Oh, hundreds, yeah.
Hundreds. What goes through your mind 10 seconds before you start?
I love this question. What you're trying to do, and if you can imagine the setting, at the World Championships, you're in front of upwards of 1,000 people. The rooms can be a lot smaller than that, but it can swell to that size. And the light is on you. You're standing there, maybe 2 or 3 pieces of paper with some notes in front of you, and you're getting ready to speak. And there are few times in my life where I feel more vulnerable than that, right? Because you're out there saying, this is what I believe. I'm about to say it. What do you think? And it's not expressing yourself in agreement or, just being friendly. It's saying, I have a strong view and I'm going to put it out there. So that's the basic setup. And in the 10 seconds, the way in which I think about it is when you're trying to persuade someone, you're trying to create a weather in the room, right? And a feeling in the room. And for me, those 10 seconds are used creating that weather, first of all, in myself, right? So if it's a somber debate, it has to be a kind of somber, serious mood. If it has to be kind of clinical and precise and methodical and really rationally reasoned, that's the kind of weather you want. If it's passionate and emotional and you need a lot of activation energy, that's the kind of weather you want. So in those 10 seconds, I'm creating that weather in myself, often going through the first line of my speech in my head. And in the last maybe 5 seconds that I have remaining, I do what my mom once taught me to do, which is you take 3 deep breaths. And you slow things down a little bit. So, time dilation is real. Those 10 seconds feel like quite a long time, actually, and that's how I spend that time.
Go to the advice that your mother gave you. I'm so curious about that. Where did that originate?
Yeah, I think it comes from When you're in a debate scenario, there's just a desire to rush in, right? And we feel that in our day-to-day disagreements too. And I think it's a reminder that you have time, right? And that you gain time by moving more deliberately, by getting outside your own head, outside the urgency of the thing you have to say right away, and taking what's not more than 5 seconds just to center yourself before you start.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I mean, you talk about how we rush into what we're thinking. The conversation right now, politically or socially, is so heated, and it seems like no one's listening to each other. It seems like no one is taking those 10 seconds or the 5 seconds to just find the weather in the room.
Yeah, for sure. And a common thread through all of that is it's not about you, right? And what is silence if not giving up the space for someone else? That could be for the audience. That could be for the listener. And that, I think, is one of the key lessons to draw from debate, that if you want to have a hope of persuading someone, of changing someone's mind, what you have to say has to be as much about the other person as it does about you. And so that, you're making me think of it. I hadn't quite thought of it in these terms, but those 5 seconds of silence is kind of like, an empty chair that you have around the table in the memory of someone, or as a reminder of someone whose interests have to be considered. It's vacating space so that others can fill it in.
So how do you do that in a skill-wise or technically, if I have something I'm so passionate about, right, that I want to talk about, yet I want to give space to the other person. I want to make sure I hear their side. How do I approach that?
It's a great question. I think the one way is to agree before you get into a disagreement how you're going to conduct it, right? And that could be saying some things that I think should not be too controversial, which is we should give each other roughly equal time to speak. And we should agree when one person speaks, no one else does, right? And that doesn't mean you're not going to be able to respond, but it just means I'm going to be able to finish my point. And I think this is not something people don't often appreciate, but it's actually helpful for the other side to fully get out their point so that you know what you're responding to and they feel like they've been heard. Because, kind of like the people who call foul and say the game was rigged, when you've been interrupted or when you feel like you haven't been heard, you can say, even when the other side wins the argument, but I never got a fair chance. So in order for that not to scuttle the result of the argument that you've had, you want to make sure everybody's gotten a fair chance to be heard, and agreeing before you jump into the debate that that's how you're going to get through it can be a useful way to do that.
Okay, so start off having kind of a level playing field to say, you're going to talk, I'm going to talk, we're both going to be heard.
Exactly. So every disagreement should start with some agreement, and that's agreement especially about how we're going to have the conversation.
That definitely probably does not happen in most conversations, right? And most.
Right. I think that's true. And, one common response that I hear to this kind of thing is it sounds artificial, right? And there's something unnatural about it. But in some ways, this kind of another word for artificial in this context is that it's design, right? Can we design our conversations in a way that better suits our needs, that allows us to connect with one another? I think we can. And being more deliberate about some of the issues that matter most to us, I think can be a good thing. And, we are nowadays in yoga, we're being deliberate about our breathing.
Yeah,
we're thinking consciously about that. I think with something as complicated and difficult as disagreement, some of that kind of thoughtfulness can be a big help.
Okay, I love that. That's a good starting point. Next off, it brings me to what conversations or debates should we engage in, and are there some we just simply shouldn't engage in?
It's a great question, and it's a lesson that I had to learn the hard way. Right, when you're coming up in debate, when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and so
Right.
and you think, I got this, I can do this.
I know those people.
Exactly, and I'm sure I have aspects of that in me as well, and especially for someone like me who, I was a very shy kid. I moved to Australia from South Korea when I was a kid, didn't speak the English language, thought I would have to live in this kind of agreeable, acquiescent sort of way. That experience of getting good at arguing was a very heady one and an addictive one. And it comes at enormous personal cost at some point. It basically precludes romantic interest. Friendships, they tend to suffer. And so you sort of learn, wait, hang on, being a debater all the time is probably not it's probably not what you got to do. And so where I got to with that, leader, is saying it's cleverness to know how to argue every point, but it's wisdom to know which arguments to pursue and which to let go. And
very wise.
And
and probably very difficult.
And difficult. And the framework that I came up with is a checklist to consult before you jump into a disagreement, which is to ask it's called the RISA checklist. It's to ask 4 questions. First, whether the argument between you and the other side is real, so it's not an imagined slight or something like that, that it's important enough to justify having the dispute, that it's specific enough, so you're not debating the virtues of liberalism in the 20 minutes you have when you're dropping off the kids, and that the two sides are aligned in their reasons for wanting to have the disagreement. So one side is not in there just to hurt the other's feelings. Mm-hmm. So checking before we jump into an argument whether these kind of ground conditions are there for it to end up successfully, that I think can help. Okay,
I want you to just repeat that again, because that's a concept that doesn't come natural, but the criteria that we want to use is this RISA.
The RISA, RISA. Real, is the disagreement real? Is it important enough? Is it specific? And are the two sides aligned?
So what comes to mind for me is that could be okay on one side, but maybe not on the other.
One person believes it is and the other person believes it is. I think you have to get to a point where you agree on and when you are aligned on those. And if you are not, I don't think debate or disagreement is the best kind of conversation you can have, right?
Meaning what? What do you mean by that?
Meaning if you're not even sure whether the disagreement between you and the other side is real, the more appropriate thing could be just to ask the person a bunch of questions, to interview them, or to just hear them out, right? But disagreement is something much more involved, right? It's about presenting what you believe, hearing what they have to say, responding to one another. And for you to get into that and for it to be successful, I think ensuring those conditions are there is essential.
So when you're debating, there are a lot of other things that come up. And I'm talking about, what we see on the news, if you're in an actual debate, when you're talking to someone, people don't always speak the truth.
Yeah.
Someone's truth might not be your truth, and it might not be fact-based. How do you approach that?
It's a great question, and it's a hard question. I think my answer used to be that the great advantage of truth over lie is that things tend to just add up, right? And when you think about a teenager lying about the curfew, where were you, and then what did you do? Just things don't add up, right? And they get caught, and in that way, debate is a tremendous engine for unearthing the truth because you pursue all those contradictions. Now, I used to believe that, but what we're starting to see is mistruths and lies becoming formative of entire worldviews, so that there is no contact with the truth. If you have a whole QAnon-style theory of everything, it's very hard to find those contradictions that we were once able to do. So I would say two things here. One is it's an argument for more debate-style education at a young age, so everybody, that all of us as citizens have those skills to be able to evaluate truth claims, to separate them out, to think about them critically. But more practically in our day-to-day lives, one thing that I think I've found helpful is to agree before jumping into the debate what our standards of truth are in this conversation, right? So one of the things that I notice a lot with kind of people who have unorthodox pseudoscientific views, for example, is they keep changing the baseline, right? So they say, give me one study that shows me climate change is doing all these catastrophic things. You produce the study and they say, give me another one, or this one is flawed for all that reason. So before they can move the goalposts in that way, you might want to say, so what will it take for me to convince you?
I like that.
And getting them to commit to that standard means there's a standard of accountability that you're both beholden to.
I like that. Okay, so what would it take for me to convince you X, Y, and Z?
Exactly. What would it take for you to believe this is true?
I'm so curious about there's so many topics that we can talk about, and I know in the book
Sure.
you
we'll get through them.
Yeah, we'll get through them. You use the quote from Donald Trump when he came up and he said, all Mexicans are rapists, or you use that as an example of what? Of factless facts. How do you approach that? I mean, we're going into this political climate. He sort of moved the baseline on argument, debate, truth. How do we now, and I'm specifically talking about us in politics.
Yes.
Because there's so much about what to believe, what's true.
Yeah.
We avoid some conversations because we are simply just on complete opposite sides. How do you approach that?
Yeah. So I would say two things here. One is with the quotation that you named, the difficulty with statements like that is they hover somewhere between a factual claim and a normative claim, right? So the factual claim in this instance is indefensible, that a certain race of people are criminals, right? The normative political point, which is something like we have a problem with the volume of immigration into the country, that might be more plausible, right? People might have legitimate disagreements about that. But it's very important for the health of our public conversation for us to hold politicians to account and say, wait, are you making an actual fact claim here, or are you making a broader political point? And in either way, you should speak more precisely because words have consequences, right? And we should not tolerate political leaders lying, right? Not in a democracy where we count on those words to give our consent to be governed. So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind there. I think the second is, that political campaign between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and in particular the debates between the two of them, came as a moment of real crisis for me. I mean, I
bet.
I had spent my whole life up to that point debating. It was the activity through which I found my voice, through which I found my place in the world. And actually, it was in January 2016 that I won the World Universities Championship. So that was the apex of my career. And the presidential cycle happened months after that, right? And the debates happened less than a year after that. And for me, what that showed me, Alita, was that debate, as with any human activity, has both positives and negatives. It contains the best of us and the worst of us. And it's true that in debate, sometimes, unless we're careful, flattery is rewarded, right? Sometimes we reward the spectacle of strength, the showmanship, rather than the substance. And for me, that is a weakness of debate. It's something I have to deal with, having written a book about the virtues of debate. But it shows me that the activity is essentially human. And for us as citizens to be able to demand better, we have to have a positive idea of what our public conversations should sound like. And I think that comes from a better knowledge of what debate can and can't do for us.
So if you had been in the World Debate Championship after all that we've been through in the last 5 years, would it have changed how you approach the conversation or the debate?
It's a great question. I mean, the fact is the debate world, like our society, has bullies, right? So this is a pathological kind of strain that we've had to deal with, right? And so maybe it is that I would have been especially careful, and it's taken me this many years to wrestle with how do we keep the good and mitigate the bad. So I don't know if I would have been so thoughtful about it, but I know I would have been wrestling with it. But I think I'm not sure it would have changed an enormous amount immediately, because the activity and the community has built up these defenses, right, over a long time. And so I think it does have a certain immunity to that. But I'm sure I would have been wrestling with the significance of the question in a new way.
So are you looking forward to what's coming, the future debates? Do you watch these now with a different scope?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I think one thing I learned is that I've observed is I do think we as a political community, I mean, I live in the US, right? So when I look around just the society, you did see in those 2016 debates and the 2020 presidential debates, I do think we as a political community are learning something about debates. So you remember, this was a moment of real hope for me when in the Biden-Trump debates, they switched off the microphone when it wasn't your turn to speak.
Yes.
This seemed to me incredible progress and a complete no-brainer from the perspective of a debater. When you're speaking, of course, when it's not your turn, you're not speaking. Those are the rules.
Right.
And those have been the rules all the way throughout. I think it's just that it was on the moderator to sort of shush them rather than actually switching off the microphone. And so there's that. I think there is, at least in a lot of the conversations that I have with just ordinary people, there is a kind of knowledge that develops where people are able to say, well, of course politicians are going to do that. Of course they're going to call each other names. And still we can be drawn into that. We can be attracted to it goes viral for a reason, but
becomes a spectacle.
The spectacle of it. But I do think there is a learning that happens, right? When you don't encounter things for the first time. You've seen this playbook before.
So when you are in a competitive debate, do they turn the microphone off for the other side?
Yeah. You're not given a microphone. There's one microphone. there's something to that.
Yeah. So that was a no-brainer for you. Of course, there's no microphone there. What else are the intricacies when you're competitively debating? I was not a debater in school. I don't have that background, but I'm so curious about what an actual competitive debate, the format of it is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it's very simple. It requires no equipment. And I went to public school, and it's just one teacher who gets a group of kids, splits them into two teams. One team says yes to the topic, the other team says no. So the first topic I ever had was that we should ban all zoos. So half the kids are saying ban the zoos, and half the kids are saying no. And depending on, you can have the number of team members varies. It can be as few as 2, it goes up to 5. And the first speaker of the team saying yes speaks, gives a few arguments. Then a representative of the no team speaks. Then it goes back to the yes team, someone else speaks, no team, someone else speaks. So it's fairly straightforward. It toggles between the two teams. And maybe the other little intricacy to tease out is you don't get to choose the topic. And importantly, you don't get to choose which side you're on. So half the times you're arguing for something you don't believe.
Ugh.
Just for the hour.
Yeah.
And producing the best argument that you can for that side.
And when do you get that topic? How far in advance?
It varies. At the university level, sometimes as few as 15 minutes.
Oh.
In other formats, especially at the younger years, you can have weeks to research and write out speeches and prepare arguments.
So for your world championship in 2016,
we had 15 minutes.
You had 15 minutes. What was the topic?
The topic was very funny. The topic was that the global poor would be justified in pursuing a complete Marxist revolution.
Oh, wow. And which side were you on?
We were saying yes, and I was the first speaker, and I was wearing a tuxedo, which is like the wardrobe, arguing for this Marxist uprising. And it was, that's the kind of thing that makes you rethink some of your choices.
Is there a significance or a strategy in the order of who speaks when?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So I always spoke before my debate partner, who I actually met in high school when we were opponents in the grand final of the World High School Championships. And then we went to Harvard and we met up, and we still basically live together now. And so it just has to do with strengths, comparative strengths. I was more interested and more confident in raising arguments, and that kind of what we were saying before about just setting a weather for the room, setting a framework through which we want the audience to understand our arguments. And he was better at responding and rebutting the other side and adding depth to the arguments. So that's how we chose.
And how long do you speak for?
In that format, 8 minutes. So 15 minutes to prepare an 8-minute speech. It's a tall order, and for the first few goes of it, you barely have 5 minutes worth of material. And it usually goes like this. It's usually that in the beginning, you can't think of enough things to say. That's the elementary phase. The intermediate phase is now you can think of too much to say. So you have 16 minutes worth of material. Then the most advanced form, you have about 8 minutes to say again. So I think debaters go through that progression. And I've seen this, when I talk to business audiences and people in all different areas of life. I think the stages of mastery go through something like this. Mm-hmm. At the beginning, you fall short. I don't know if you see it in your practice. And then they kind of overdo it. They don't edit enough. They have too much to say. And then you land around where you're meant to be.
Right. Who did you go up against?
We were against a team from the University of Sydney, from the University of Cambridge, and the University of Toronto.
And
So
were these
that was
people were these people that you had seen before throughout the
Yeah,
years? Or
they
the
are.
same?
We all know each other. I mean,
Yeah.
the thing about debate is, and here's the other reason why you can't be completely wretched in a debate, and rude and bullying is because regardless of whether you win or lose, in some ways you live together, right? You have to see them the next week
Right.
on a different side of the topic, on a different city sometimes, and. So we knew all about them. We knew their strengths and weaknesses, but we also knew in some ways we are inhabiting this community together.
Right.
And more, back to our political discussion, I think there is a metaphor for that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's the winning and the losing, but there's also the ability to continue the conversation. That matters more.
Yeah, I think that raises a really good point, is that we are in this together. And it goes to, why would you ever be personal or unkind? Or, you're saying you make sure that you play by the rules and all that because you're going to see these people again. They may end up being your teammates. Isn't that just humanity? Isn't that just how we should be?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And, one of the questions I had to think about is, what's a good argument? Right. And when you're promoting a book, you want to make all kinds of promises, right? This is going to get you a raise at work. It's going to win everybody, win friends and influence people, right? But then the answer I settled on is a lot more modest, which is a good argument is one in which both sides walk away feeling like they would do that again.
Mm.
Because that's all it takes for the conversation to continue. And I think that aspiration can be timely and useful at a time when it's so easy for us to forget as citizens, how irrational is it to forget it as family members and lovers that you're going to see them? They're in your house.
Yeah.
That it is a repeat game.
Yeah.
And that to view each disagreement as just one piece of a broader relationship, I think that is something to remind ourselves of.
So you're saying when you get into an argument, or a debate, because argument has a negative connotation to me. When you say argument, I hesitate. I'm like, we don't want to argue. But you're saying when you get into one of those, to make sure that both sides leave feeling good, or that they would do it again. Isn't that really hard to achieve? Because you're convincing someone of something they may not have thought of, or I didn't convince you of what I wanted you to believe. So that's a really tall order.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I would say two things. One is it requires broadening our definition of what winning is.
Okay.
So you're right that one is persuading the other side.
Yeah.
But if that's the only way in which you're thinking of debate, you're setting yourself up for failure, because one side must leave unhappy. It's zero sum, right? Because they didn't get to persuade the other side. So how about saying, we learned something from this exchange. We were able to deepen our relationship because I saw you as you, not just the ways in which you're similar to me, but the ways in which you're dissimilar too. And what about just saying, and this I hear a lot from people, just I felt like I was heard. I was understood. And I didn't change your mind, but you got me. You knew where I was coming from. I think that kind of broadening can be helpful. And I think the other thing I would say, Lita, is debate and disagreement is just one mode of conversation. So once we've had a disagreement, we can take what we've learned from that and have different kinds of conversation too. So once we've had a disagreement, then we might enter into negotiation.
Good point.
Right?
Yeah.
Then we might just go out for ice cream.
Right.
And the point is, I hope debate and disagreement can be additive to those other ways of being together too.
Yeah. How did you get into debate? You mentioned it just a little bit, and I know I read it in the
Yeah.
book, but I love the story.
So I was 8 years old when I moved from South Korea to Australia. I didn't speak English at the time, and the few phrases I knew from textbooks and English classes, they run away from you very quickly.
What do you mean? What?
Your grasp on those, your ability to produce those words that it just escapes you when you're in a real life conversation. And if real life conversation is hard as a second speaker of a language, disagreements are nearly impossible, right? People don't speak in full sentences when you're disagreeing often. They interrupt, you become really passionate. And I sensed as well what a lot of newcomers do. And I experienced this as an immigrant, but I think it's a pretty common feature of the human experience that when you're feeling defensive and out of place and at risk of being othered, you don't want to draw attention to your differences. You just want to say, I'm kind of one of, I'm one of the group. And so you agree a lot, you nod, you smile, you keep a lot of your thoughts to yourself. And I thought I was going to live the rest of my life in that groove of agreeableness. Just being,
boy.
that guy. Yeah, exactly. And the thing that changed for me was my 5th grade teacher in elementary school said to me, on the debate team, when one person speaks, no one else does. And to me, after a childhood of being interrupted and spun out of conversation, that promise of attention, of being heard, was pretty irresistible. So then I signed up.
Yeah. Wow. And you stuck with it. It wasn't just
I
a
did.
one-off. Yeah. What made you stick with it?
I think the activity is so grand and so vast. So I felt like just as I was starting to learn one aspect of the activity, it presented something else. So I learned how to do the logical thing of coming up with a good argument, right? And then I go through that in the book. Then the problem is, but then the other side has arguments, so you're going to have to respond. You're going to have to come up with something to be able to do that. Then you think, oh, there's a live audience, and they're not just reasoning machines, right? They have emotions. They want to be acknowledged. They want to be moved. And so you're going to have to learn something about how to use speech and gesture to be able to do that. And so I think it puts you in a permanent learner's mindset, and it gave you plenty of rewards on that front. So I kept going.
Yeah, you kept going, and I think you mentioned this in the book, or I read it somewhere from you, that you say that people who are competitive debaters, when they're done, they're done. They walk away from the sport, and they generally, that's it. So like they're done, they move on. But you haven't done that yet. Instead, you decided to coach. Then you decided to come out with the book. Excuse me. What's keeping you going?
It's a great question. I mean, in some ways, just my recovery is not complete. So let's see how that goes. I think the one part of it was external circumstances. So that this political moment, I was a political reporter, I was a journalist, and I was writing on this stuff. And
where were you a political journalist? I must have missed that.
I was back home in Australia.
Oh, in Australia. Okay.
After graduating. So it was my first job out of school. And, polarization seemed to be the problem that we were not dealing with, not only dealing with at home, but around the world. And it was in the desire to say something positive, right? To say something helpful in that I found myself going back to this community that managed to build itself around having arguments, which is a remarkable thing. So one part of it is external circumstances. another part of it, I think, is just I think there's just an unforgivable vanity in writing about yourself so much when you're in your 20s, and
Well, that's very honest.
and I'm totally guilty about that. But I have felt it's nothing to do with me, but it has to do with some of the things that I've done. Immigration, right? Learning the craft of debating, that has put me close to some universal themes that I think are worth thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find your voice,
Mm-hmm.
right? How do you deal with others in their fullness? That's in their differences as well as their similarities.
Yeah.
How do you overcome those differences as a community and try and make those tensions a source of strength for you rather than a weakness? So those questions seem to me so vast and difficult and complicated that it's just taken me this many years to work through them.
And do you think you've worked through them or not quite yet?
I mean, I love what I've just been so grateful to have had the opportunity with the book to put out a statement of what I, at this young age and at this stage of my life, believe on these issues. I'm comfortable with the answers that I've come up with. I think they are additive, certainly for my understanding and for others too, I hope. But it's not a conversation I hope to exit from, because every day I'm just learning about it from how people respond to it and what they've seen in their lives.
Yeah. I want to just go back for a second. First of all, I love the book. I really did. Thank you for
reading it so carefully. I know you did. Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Not just as a communicator myself, but just it raised so many issues. I love that you gave perspective, and I wanted to ask you about that a bit, because we talked about history. You mentioned John Quincy Adams. You mentioned Malcolm X. I mean, I learned so much.
Yeah.
Are they role models to you? How do they fit into debate for you?
They're role models, and I hope it's not self-aggrandizing to say they're colleagues, right? Because they were in this community with me. So Malcolm X says he found his voice in debate when he was on the team in Norfolk Prison, right? And it was in that experience of hearing his words translate to an audience, seeing them react, that he thought, I can do something with speech. I had similar experiences. And it has just been a feature of history that former debaters have ended up in very significant political, world-changing historical positions. And I have to think their education had a part to play in that, right? So there's certainly people I admire. They embody the best of the activity. They prove what the activity can do, not just in its kind of niche subculture limited way, but when it makes claims to national and global affairs. So I draw a lot of inspiration from that, and they're just great stories. So I relished in telling their stories too.
Yeah, and you talk about your own experience kind of coming to Boston and reflecting on all these great debaters, orators that you had studied, that you knew about. What was that like for you when you came from Australia to the US to now this major university? You had achieved a lot, but you hadn't gotten there yet. Still so much.
So, I mean, I'll let you know when I figure that out, because I feel like I'm going through that every day. I guess the lesson I learned from debate that helps me a lot, and even with the book, I end up in conversations and rooms where I'm like, am I worthy of being here? I think the thing I learned is what it takes for you to raise your voice in that setting is not confidence in yourself, but confidence in the other person to receive you with some grace, to be able to respond to what you're saying and to make something positive of that interaction. So for me, it was not always, gosh, I have something that I'm going to say that's going to impress this world-class academic sitting across the room from me at Harvard. It was, I believe they can make something of my contribution, and that together we can develop that conversation into a kind of education. And that faith, that leap has been rewarded, I think, time and time again.
Well, that's beautiful if you're at Harvard, but if you're rolling, through the rest of the world, that doesn't always happen. You can't have faith that the other person is going to expand your.
The faith is let down at Harvard as many times as anywhere else, and I'm sure more so in some ways. But I started as a junior newspaper reporter, earning very little money. It wasn't a particularly prestigious thing to do. It wasn't a place where an advanced university degree meant very much.
Yeah.
Newspapers in Australia were traditionally considered a trade, right?
Yeah.
So it's just kind of something you did. And in those settings, and as a reporter, you see so many different segments of society, and you have to make similar leaps, as you know, all the time. And I felt that it required a similar kind of mindset, which is a mindset of some humility.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to have you go back and kind of review some of the points. But before I get there was a little story in the book that I wanted. You didn't talk a lot about your family, but you did mention when you got to school, when you, as a freshman, your mother came with you, right?
Yes.
Okay. And she says, I should stay here. I should. What did she mean by that?
I think one thing she meant by that, which I think is true, is that she, as a then 50-year-old Korean woman, professional, would probably have gotten more out of the education than I would have, which I think is true because she knows more, she's wiser, she would know how to handle herself, and perhaps she would value the experience more than I would as a kid, right? Who's went to great high school and was the beneficiary of all these opportunities. So I think that was a part of it. Another part of it, I think, was in this kind of parental, generational way, saying, "You're doing this for all of us," And in my family, that was and remains a strain of our thinking. My parents moved to Korea at great personal cost and discomfort that comes from moving when you're middle aged, right? To a new country.
They moved from Korea.
From Korea. So this is when I was 10, right?
Yeah.
So and they did that in significant part for the educational opportunities. So there is this sense of when you're here, you're representing us too.
Yeah. So what's it like? What's the conversation like at home? Do you win every argument and they say, Bo, we're not going to talk to you about this. You're not involved.
Very deferential. I mean, my parents are great arguers, and my mom in particular, actually.
Yeah.
And maybe you get a flavor of that, her saying, I should be here, you should go home. But she, my grandfather was the unusual man in that age who gifted my mom the Second Sex, the Simone de Beauvoir feminist text, and said, you should. I think he said to her, "You don't have to marry if you don't want to. You should have a career, and you should have your own views." And I'm sure my dad's, been on the brunt of some of the arguing that has ensued as a result. But I grew up in that household, so we don't hold back on that. But there does come a moment when they say, we're your parents.
Yeah.
We're not your debating buddies.
Yeah.
So put it away. And I do.
Well, your mom sounds interesting. I'd love to hear more about your mom. Okay, so Bo, I would love for us to just get some takeaways here because we've talked about a lot of things. So as an individual, what can you do to improve your debating skills moving forward? You don't have a partner, you don't have the topic, but I want to become a better debater. I talk to people at home, I talk to people at work. I'm interested in, how do we approach that?
Yeah, I'll give you 3 quick takeaways.
Okay.
One is, as I said earlier in the program, every disagreement should start with some agreement. So agree with the other side how you're going to have the discussion, but more importantly, what the disagreement is about. Is it a factual debate that you're having? Is it a normative one? Is it a prescriptive one about what we should do, right? And so come to some agreement with the other side about the kind of conversation you're having before you begin.
Okay.
Second, make actual arguments. So a debater says an argument is not just a random set of thoughts that you have that vaguely support your views. It's a technology of persuasion, and it requires certain steps. So the key thing to keep in mind here is there are 2 things that any argument should do. It has to show that the main claim that you're making is true and that it's important, that it should change the other person's mind. So if you're arguing that we should all become vegetarian because it's good for the environment, you have to show, first of all, that being vegetarian is in fact good for the environment, so it's true, and that the fact that it's good for the environment means you should go vegetarian, as opposed to preferencing personal enjoyment, or it's a family tradition to have the turkey and Thanksgiving, whatever. So the framework I came up with in the book to help readers with that is the 4 W's. So every argument must answer these 4 questions. What is the point that you're making? Why is it true? When has it happened before? Can you give me an example? And lastly, who cares? Why should that change my mind? So what is the point? Why is it true? When has it happened before? And who cares? And that's a way of getting at those 2 things that an argument must do. The third piece of advice I'll give then is, once you've done that, you know what you're talking about, you know what your points are going to be, take a moment before you go up and present, whether in a meeting or around the dining room or whatever. Just take a few seconds to think about the other perspective, to come up with the best points for their side, to go through the argument you've just made as if through the eyes of the opposition, and try and poke as many holes in it as possible. So that, that's not empathy, right? That's not knowing exactly what the other side has to say. That requires listening, but it unsettles your certainty, that sense that you are right, this is the only perspective, so that you may be able to better listen and connect with the other side.
Okay. I'm taking notes at the same time.
Terrific. I can hear it.
You can hear me typing away. I love that. Listening. Touch on that just for a moment. We briefly went through it, but how important is the listening, and how important is the other person's perspective?
It's incredibly important, because when you're in conversation, you are not broadcasting, right? You are not doing it for the benefit of some hypothetical audience, because you don't have an audience.
Great point.
you're just at home. So, but it's very easy to do that, right? To, instead of seeing the other person for who they are, even if they're our aunt or our sister, we can say, oh, I'm now talking to a Democrat or a Republican, or I'm talking to a feminist, or I'm talking to a vegetarian, to make someone singular in that way. So the only hope you ever have of convincing the person sitting across the room from you is to hear their concerns and to make your argument connect with them. So that might start with asking them questions of the kind we talked about before. What is it going to take for me to convince you? What is it that you really care about here? Why? How did you come to think those things? And once you've done that, you may be able to enter into a disagreement, into an argument where you're making these points that connect with those concerns. So talk to the person across the table from you, not over their head to some imaginary audience. And so you know where you're aiming towards. Listen and ask them questions to know what it is that it will take to convince them.
It's such a great starting point, and it goes so much farther than, like you said, beyond yourself, beyond this conversation, and just better for everyone, better for society. I mean, you said it beautifully that we need to be able to do this.
I hope so. I mean, when you think about in the grand sweep of history, the human achievement is in some ways we found ways to manage our disagreements. That's what we can do that animals can't, and that's responsible for just the magnificence of human achievement and our future survival. Not only as a people, but as nations, as political communities, relies on us being able to do this. So I consider debate an important part of civic education and communication in general to be an important part of civic education. I also view it as a responsibility.
I think you're right. Bo Seo, thank you so much for taking the time.
I enjoyed it so much.
Thank you for writing the book. Good arguments. I'll put it in the show notes. Anything I didn't ask you?
No, I mean, it was a really wonderful conversation, and thank you for the thoughtful questions.